What's up, you guys? It's BP Riley. Welcome back to the channel, and thanks for tuning in a bunch. I really appreciate it. And today we're going to kind of get into a bit of a weird subject, and I haven't really seen too many other videos about this, but it's something that on this channel we talk about all the time, and that is kind of the archaeology of digging up these old guitars and kind of reading the story back. And I want to get into it today and kind of talk about it. I don't know everything on this subject. I only know what I've picked up here and there in trading guitars and playing them and seeing how they develop and seeing how they wear out and seeing the little things that happen, you know, when you take the mic stand and do a slide up the fretboard and you feel really cool at the show that night, and then the next morning you look and you've got ruts in your frets, and maybe 60 years later somebody's still looking at those ruts being like, oh, look at this guy, he liked mic stands. I want to talk about that a little bit today, kind of kick it around, talk about some basic identifiers as they relate to the finish, talk about some ideas on how to look at a fretboard and kind of pull it apart. You know, because like we were talking about in the last video, it's kind of one of those things where, you know, if we can look rearward, we tend to, as a culture, have a far better time being prepared for what's coming down the line. You know, because it's like Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure do rhyme. I always love that line. It's so good. So I like having an understanding for these instruments, and and if I had an instrument that I was playing and it was really dear to me right now, I wouldn't mind at all if 80 years from now somebody was really pawing through it, trying to figure out what kind of music was he playing, you know, and how is he standing and all this sort of stuff. All the different little things that kind of slowly contribute to a guitar's character over a period of years. Anyway, let's go ahead and have a look at this 1966 Fender Musicmaster 2. We're zoomed in here and we start to see the impressions that have retained paint. These are just low spots. When I came back and I hit the guitar before, we had to chip it away with picks. That was really quite time consuming and very messy. Not suggested, but it was the safest way to reveal the paint. Anything more aggressive and we could have burned through the nitro pretty easy. It was already really thin in the spots where you could see through down into the actual factory finish. So when it came to these, I left these alone, and the reason that I did is two reasons. Number one, getting each of these cleared out is going to be very, very difficult, whether they are exposed wood or remnants of paint. Also, another thing is, we're not looking at a factory defect in the paint necessarily, or air pockets in the paint. We're looking at impact nicks. What we see here is that there's a uniformity to the distortions of the paint. If we look right here, we see a half moon. We see multitudes of half moon impressions being made, but they're kind of randomized. And the same exact impressions are over by the top horn. I've filled some of them in because I thought that some of those impressions were a little too much. It kind of looked a little too damaged and it was a bit distracting. So I tried to soften the impact of that damage a little bit. But we do have all these impressions. Now here's the thing. They're not pick impressions because picks sweep. They don't jab. So there's that whole problem. Also, another thing is that if we're looking at this area, what we notice is that the chips and the indents have a tendency to also align with a discoloration mark. The orientation of the markings and the level of impression, the variation of the level of impressions, leads me to believe that this is a cufflink, or maybe a button on the inside of somebody's sleeve. You know, you got to remember this thing was sold in '66 and it's a student model. So you've got somebody in 1966, 1967, 1968 who's probably, you know, between the ages of 12 and 20, and they're a little bit younger and they're using this. They might be playing it at school, they might be playing it in a school band, they could be playing it in a rock and roll band, you could be playing it at church, and they might have to wear a jacket. And that the reason that we have damage here, and the reason we have damage here is because as they were strumming, they were kind of just, you know, super high strung. It was strapped way up high, way up in front of them, not down by the belt. And they were just kind of Jerry and the Pacemakers strumming away. And that would actually give us that type of splayed impression and damage, all those tiny, tiny, tiny little nicks and scratches that started to come up because of that very minute impact. But when it's happening over and over again, you know, water weareth away the stone that the hammer shall not break. We see the same damage up here. At first, I was a little confused about that, you know, because you're not going to have that type of accurate replication. But let's go ahead and bring you into the fretboard. I want to show you something real quick that relates to this damage right here. So what you see here is you see a really square edge on the fret. But as we get over towards this fret, and definitely this one and this one, what we see is what I call the Keith Richards recess, where you're picking way over here. And as you are strumming, the natural half circle motion of your picking comes down and sweeps across, but then lifts ever so slightly to strike the top 3 strings. Because unless you're really swinging your elbow, your wrist is doing a lot, and you're not getting a straight fore and aft. You're getting kind of this scooping motion across. And this is why we have much diminished damage right here. By the time that we got the blue paint off, we started to see that this paint was already gone miles before we got there. So what we know is it was used, it was transported pretty regularly. As a matter of fact, if we look at the method with which that this wear has happened, the way that it rides right up to the edge and then almost immediately stops. This is kind of a very unique thing. You'll see this sometimes on relics and stuff like that, where people sand them, but they don't take into effect the fact that the arm might rest over this area. And this might kind of set off your alarms. But in the actuality, this is actually what you want to see. They would shift fore and aft periodically. Every time you picked up the guitar and you set the case on its end, or every time you were walking with it, it would start shifting around a little bit. With Les Pauls and SGs, Tellys and Strats, you know, you kind of always have form-fit cases that are built with intolerances that are so close that the guitar doesn't shift at all. But what people don't realize is the Musicmasters and the Mustangs and the Duo Sonics always got worn out right here. And the reason is because their cases were cheap. They were flat-bottom cases in which there was a lot of liberty for the guitar to move around. The Mustang cases even had a little nylon strap that would go across the neck. Okay, now we're taking a look at the neck and we're at fret 2. And I want to show you this because this is also a very interesting thing that you can spot when you're really getting in there with a microscope, is this guy right here. This little batch of scratches, and you see another tiny little batch right there, and the two of them are kind of sticking up. And then if you look up here, you see string impressions. Those are the coils of the A string resting against the fretboard, and then once again the slightly wider and more pronounced coils of the E string resting against the fretboard. So what that tells us is that whoever it was that was playing this for the first time around had nails that weren't long, they were trimmed very, very short. And the reason is because we don't have depth on this. It's very, very faint. It's very, very light. We also see it right here. The reason that you're going to start to get these formations on the fretboard is because when you're making an E or an A, this is the area where your finger has a tendency of being pointed directly at the fretboard. But what we see here is that they weren't really cowboy chord players. We have a very light rut here, very barely there, rut right there, and a couple small impressions. But if we look at the apex of this fret, it's actually very, very high when you start to compare it with this one, which is a little bit more rounded off. We have more damage and we start to see coil impressions and things like that. If you look at the top of this fret, the top of this fret, they definitely have lived 2 different lives. So what that tells us is that this guitar's life began that way, over there to the left, where a lot of playing started to happen in the bar chord area. So we don't have a folkie here doing cowboy chords. We have somebody who's playing a more contemporary form of music. As we're sitting up by the 5th fret, what we notice here is that the frets have become flat, they've become swept, smooth, and that the very bottom of the fret is almost completely level with the edge of the fretboard. So we have a prominent amount of wear all around here, but the person was pretty well versed. There's no particular localized area of the fret field that's really beat up. It's all pretty light. So whoever it was, beginner or advanced, regardless, they did seem to play with a fairly light touch, and it's a little bit more buffed, we can see right around here, which tells us that we may have had, you know, bending upward, and that slowly closed the grain of the wood and buffed it to a shine. Now this is conclusive with what we were talking about before as far as picking. We can see right here another impression that matches the one on the body, another impression right there that matches the one on the body. So you can see, and the angle of the approach is all identical to the body damage, and then right over here you see that the fretboard has worn away. Now the likelihood that somebody would be playing solos this high up on the fretboard is not terribly likely. So what that tells us is that this rounding is more than likely coming from the departure sweep of the pick or the penny that this player was using. Judging by this impression right here, it's too sharp for it to be a pick, at least any pick in a conventional sense that is made of plastic. This right here looks a lot like the edge of, say, a nickel. There's no serration in the impression that would give you the idea that it was made with a coin that had serrated sides on the edge the way that a dime does, but it's very, very narrow, and the impression is very, very defined even after all these years. Okay, now while this might not be particular to a lot of different guitars, because a lot of different guitars no longer come with nitrate pickguards, this is typical. So if you've ever looked at a vintage Fender and you said to yourself, boy, the quality control is really lacking back then, you can say that about the pocket. There is a bit of liberty right there. These were student models, and this was, for lack of a better term, the phrase that they used to use, which was unskilled labor, which, you know, in the modern times we realize that any labor is skilled, you know. The truth of it is that even though they did have some liberties with tolerances, this is not actually a factory defect. The white part being away from the neck joint is, you can see the checking there underneath of the nitro. The nitrate itself probably rode all the way up to the edge of the neck. They did that when they were new. It made it look a lot better, and when it left the line, nobody complained, and then the space underneath was left. But the problem with nitrate is that it's basically the same stuff that you would use film nitrate out of. It's very volatile, it's very easy to work, it melts at a low temperature and all that sort of stuff. It's also flammable, very, very flammable. So the instability of the nitrate guard has reacted to heat cycles. So this gap right here tells us that not only was this Mustang used on a constant basis, not only did somebody adjust the truss rod without being too careful right there, but at the same time it was kept in an area where we did have pretty volatile temperature swings. Now that could be anywhere. That could be the attic of a house in New York. It could be the basement of a place in Washington. Everywhere is getting those hot and cold cycles, but this particular guitar, in the case or not, was prone to volatile temperature swings on a fairly regular basis, which accelerated the shrinkage of the nitrate guard. Now when we take a look at the corner here, we're once again looking at this wear, which is indicative of the case, but we've also got this fragmented breakdown. While this is not an impact break, it is a compression break. Now what a compression break is if you work with surfboards at all, you know exactly what I'm talking about. A compression break essentially means that you have two different layers. You have a layer of timber, and then you have a layer of finish. That slight impressions are made, or pressure over time, where the guitar may be rested on this particular area, even on a carpet or something like that. And over years, that has slightly compressed the timber here. The timber will stay compressed, and the finish has an element of rigid memory. There's a level of comfort that the finish sits at when it is kicked off and dried. That dimension has been changed, it's been pressured, and now we have the finish cracking and delaminating and falling away from the wood right there. Somebody pretty frequently was putting their guitar down, maybe it did tip over and it slid off the wall once or twice, and instead they were putting it down on its edge like that. You know, these had the laminate on top of the finish. So if you've ever looked at a vintage guitar and you sit there and say, well, that's got to be fake, the laminate's on top of the lacquer. That's actually how Fender did it for many, many years. You know, you got to remember Fender started out as a budget model, so they weren't going to spend a lot of time being as ornate as possible. This is also during the transitional period. This is right before they went to what they call the TV laminate. That's a very large laminate where the model was big and the name Fender was big. That was part of CBS's big push to try to make Fender a more recognizable model on television and things like that. You know, their problem with it was that everybody was playing Fenders, but nobody who was watching was seeing the names. So they went to that big headstock, the big oar, which this is, and then eventually went to the bigger laminate. On this guy, we see lots of small checking, intricate checking, front and back. Kind of hard to see on the front. It's a little bit soft, and the shine is gone. Usually I'd buff this out, but because this is on top, I'm going to leave it alone. I don't want to damage it or anything like that. We can also see that the laminate is conclusive with what we were talking about for temperature swings. When the timber starts to expand and contract constantly, the laminate is very, very frail, and there's absolutely no resiliency to it. So as it expands and contracts, the laminate starts to tear, and the paint breaks away and loses its bond to the laminate surface, and we start getting those pockets of missing paint right there. Right here, and right there, and definitely right there. Those breaks through to the finish, being also accompanied with these slight linear impressions, tells us that this particular player had a propensity to tilt his guitar up against a high-lying amp. Could have been any kind of amp, but given these little lines right here, I'd say it was a Fender amp. They have serrated knobs that are on the front, and even on the, you know, the silver faces and everything like that, and the black faces where you got the tilt back, you still have a protrusion of those knobs. And I've done this myself. I'll lean the guitar up against it, and then I don't realize as the guitar shifts ever so slightly, you start to get these little lines right there. The sealant on these is pretty good. So even when you get breaks and finish, they don't turn black like they did from the Fenders of the 1970s. They have a tendency of sticking with an amber hue. It's you know, a tight grain. So essentially what you see here is there is a finish loss, but it's only relegated to the very, very top, right at the very top of the fretboard where it meets that corner. So what this tells us, and once again I may be wrong but I may be right, is that this particular player, as light as they were, did have a propensity to put their thumb right there when they were playing. Either they were doing that or they were wrapping the thumb around, Hendrix style, and this created kind of a hanging wear where they were using their hand but applying pressure here more than they were applying pressure to the back. That's all good and fine for the guitar, it doesn't damage it too much, but as a player you wouldn't really want to do that too much because you'll start to run into carpal tunnel issues later on if you're overstressing certain digits on your hand that are not necessarily designed to be the load bearer. However, we can also tell, because it's not lining up with the plate directly, that this guitar was actually misaligned for probably quite a few years. Whoever was using it, the neck plate was slightly askew to where this edge rested right up against that blue fragment of paint, and that would have been the actual positioning of the neck. This thing was out of alignment for either 7 or 8 months, enough to create damage to the finish that way, or maybe 20 or 30 years. I mean, this thing might not have ever played right. I can tell you that when it came out of the box today, it hadn't been played in probably decades. Okay, if we're traveling around the back of the guitar and we look at this knock, when you look at the radiation of the checking as it all relates surrounding the break, what we realize is that this area, not only did the finish actually give up, but there was a compression and a stress. When you have an impact like that, the checking has a tendency to kind of point its way back to the origin of its degradation. And you see also right here that we have a lot of particulate impacts. What that means is the guitar went down, smashed its edge right there, lost the finish probably almost immediately, and then bounced very lightly and landed right here, probably coming to rest either on concrete or maybe some pavement outside or something like that. But that's where you get this sort of stuff. I can feel right here, there's a little notch where it really hit hard. Now the rest of the knocks around here are just superficial stuff, the type of jazz that you get from just kind of walking in and out of a room. But that guy right there must have hurt. I imagine somebody 35, 45 years ago was probably pretty sad when they saw that happen. We do have the original pickup here. We can see MM, that's his Musicmaster 10. Looks, I can't see that date too good, but that's definitely 66. So looks like a build date of somewhere around, October of 1966, Happy Halloween, and then we've got the marking right there. So that's not bad. Original pickup, all right. Okay, so we've got the pickguard off here, and we see the remnants of the blue paint and the gold that was over it. It's kind of checking there and giving up. I left that there just because I'm not going to hide that this thing was painted once, and to tell you the truth, the contrast between the colors is actually quite striking, and it looks pretty cool now that the shielding is all cleaned up and doesn't look terrible. It's got a cool look to it. But this was fascinating. When you look at this stamp, ES, no idea. I've checked online. I don't see any other stampings on a Musicmaster or a Mustang of this year or this age or even this design that has that particular stamping. So what this tells us is that a lot like the last couple guitars that we've taken apart here, is that somebody went for a slightly more official and sophisticated method of marking their initials on the inside of the guitar, somewhere hidden away, so that if they ever did come across it again, they could theoretically have a thread of proof to prove that it was their guitar. Maybe it had been lifted or stolen or something like that. Those are just really great when you find the initials on the guitar and everything like that. It just, it really brings the whole thing to life. If you look right at the top there, you can see the checking is too extreme. It shouldn't be splitting like that. So what that tells us is that they used the wrong screws, it oversized and stressed that pocket out, and you can see it raised right there. It's just kind of pushing down and out into it. There's just a little bit too much there. I love that I opened this up and didn't find a ton of routing, because a lot of these really did get taken apart, and humbuckers are great, but you don't need to necessarily route this out. You can go for like a quarter pounder or something like that, something with huge hole pieces, or get into like hot rails or something like that. But considering how it looked before, I still think it's a good enough improvement. I still feel good about it. And I think that if anybody opened this up, hopefully they would be pleased at the cleanliness of the cleanup, and they would feel more confident in using the guitar, you know, out in front of people. But if we look at this, what we see is a lot of damage on this extreme corner right here. A couple knocks right there, but almost no damage on its opposing side. Now granted, this has been spun a couple times. I mean, I spun it when I put it back on, so it's not exactly in the orientation that it may have been for years. But what we can deduce from these impacts on one side is that whoever it was that was playing this, wherever in the country they were playing it, because it didn't come from California, they were not practicing in the house. What that tells us, these impressions on the side, is that the guitar was perpetually being rested on its back, up against the neck, up against the amp, as the neck had conclusively, you know, shown us with the scratches and everything, conclusive with the height that you would get on a Fender amp, you know, a tilt-back Fender amp. And then this impression on only one half tells us that this was resting on concrete. So they didn't play in the attic and they didn't play in the living room. This was a garage band guitar. Concrete floor, constantly being rested in the same space. Now the screw's been replaced, so we can't really tell too much there. The original screw was gone, unfortunately, but the chrome construction on this tells us that it is, even though it has been damaged, it's probably been there for 50 years, it's not original to the guitar. It may have come from another guitar, so we may be going down a blind alley on that one. And we know that because there's a very low zinc content to this plating. Now that's how that should look. You can see right there that there's tons of oxidation. You can see also that there's almost no impact whatsoever on the actual edge of the strap button. You'll also notice that there's no distortions to the shape. The cone is completely uninterrupted, and the outside perimeter has almost no damage at all. But the big tell on this, when you know that you've got nickel-plated, is that as the finish breaks away, you get these really dark steel you know, deposits on that extreme edge where the finish gave up first, and you get a lot of differentiation between finish and no finish. So that's how the factory one should look. We also know that they haven't been swapped because there's no impacts on this one. It doesn't mean that it ever served as the end pin. It was always the you know, the horn button. Well, you guys, there you have it. Just kind of a video to dive into some of the stuff that we've talked about previously, just the specificity of certain damage and how things wear out and all that sort of stuff. And you know, maybe this video is a bit of me spinning my wheels. You know, quite a few people, you know, that we're always talking constantly in the videos and stuff like that, you know, have really discussed some of this stuff, you know, kind of the archaeology of what we're doing, you know, the rearward look that we've got and the trained eyes that we have. Because, you know, even though, you know, not all of us are working on guitars all the time or anything like that. Some of us are just playing them really, really well. Some of you guys would probably burn me like a cane field in a high wind. But the only thing is that, you know, we do have a trained eye, even if we are just playing. And you've got a trained eye for this too. You know, you're spotting these little things on a guitar just as you're glancing it over. And sometimes it's interesting to kind of keep in mind that, you know, what we see as an adversity or what we see as damage is, you know, a little too frequently just character. You know, it doesn't impede the performance of the guitar, it doesn't hinder it or make it sound worse. It doesn't make it sound better, but it certainly gives it that interesting backstory, the anthropomorphized concept of this thing living a life. You know, this thing being out there and getting beat up and having good shows and bad shows, you know, in the same way that we do. No, so this is just kind of a video to kind of discuss some of the things that we're always fixated on. And if you feel like I was wrong about some things, which I very well may have been, go ahead and throw it down in the comments section. I know I can always count on you guys to chime in. And if you think that I was right, then that's nice too, and I greatly appreciate it. But either way, it was just a fun video to make about something that we don't really talk about. You know, guitar channels are kind of interesting in that we have all this freedom to discuss whatever we want. You know, in that freedom, it's kind of like being a kid with the day off of school. You know, sometimes you just wind up doing the same old thing you always do. But we do have all this freedom to discuss all these different things. This isn't network television. We don't have to worry about sponsorships. We don't have to worry about timelines. We just have to worry about, you know, the concept of just discussing it back and forth. So I thought it'd be fun to go over. Have a beautiful, beautiful day. Turn up loud as hell. And don't forget, when your neighbors come by and they complain about it, put them on drums. I will see you guys next week.